He rescued a bear cub from a fire and raised him like a son. But 20 years later, the system labeled his old friend a threat. A young bureaucrat, Jason Reeves, ordered the bear captured and locked away, calling him a danger to the public. But Ranger Tom Bennett refused to give up. He sparked a movement, defied the rules, and made one final, unforgettable move. And you won't believe how this battle for freedom ended, and why justice, in the end, walked right beside him. On the northern edge of Montana, where the forest thickens into a near whisper and mountains rise like old, tired gods, stood a small wooden cabin, weather-worn but steady, like its owner. Inside lived a 63-year-old ranger named Tom Bennett. Tom wasn't the kind of man who needed people around. He didn't measure life in schedules or traffic lights. His days followed the rhythm of birdsong and snowfall. He could tell the season by the thickness of moss or the color of lichen, and he knew each bear that passed his land, not just by track or fur, but by scent. He could remember the exact musk of a mother grizzly from 15 years ago, or the low grunt of a juvenile black bear during mating season. To outsiders, that seemed strange. To Tom, it was simply being part of the woods. The forest wasn't his job, it was his family. 22 years earlier, when Tom was still new to the service, his boots still stiff, his optimism still untouched, he'd come upon a scene that never left him. Lightning had struck an old pine grove, and the fire that followed carved a black scar across the land. Amid the smoldering ash, tucked beside a burnt stump, was a bundle of trembling fur, a bear cub, no more than a few weeks old. One paw was scorched, and his tiny body was slick with soot. But the eyes, wide, glassy, terrified, met Tom's with a kind of helplessness that demanded a promise. Tom didn't hesitate. He scooped the cub into his jacket and whispered, "You're all right now, little guy." He named him Brody. For nearly 2 years, Brody lived with Tom. He drank formula from a bottle, napped by the fireplace, and grew fast. Too fast. What began as care turned into bond, and what felt like rescue turned into love. But deep down, Tom always knew Brody was not his to keep. He belonged to the wilderness. And one brisk autumn morning, with trembling hands and a breaking heart, Tom opened the gate and let Brody go. He watched the bear disappear into the shadows of Yellowstone, strong, wild, free, and took a long time to walk back home. Years passed. Tom's beard grayed, his knees stiffened. The woods remained his companion, but something inside him had quieted. He never spoke about the bear, but every now and then, when the wind blew in just right, he thought he heard familiar rustling in the trees. He hoped. But never too much. Then, one spring, the forest began to murmur again. Deer fled from valleys they'd grazed for years. Anglers along the riverbanks spoke of a massive brown bear with a strange scar across its front leg, a deep, chain-shaped ridge that didn't look natural. Tom's breath caught in his chest when he heard. The mark was too specific, too familiar, but it had been over 20 years, a lifetime in the wild. No bear remembered that long. He told himself not to imagine things, until one morning at dawn, he opened his front door and stopped cold. There, at the far edge of his clearing, stood a bear, massive, towering. A shadow given shape and breath, but it wasn't the size that struck Tom still. It was the eyes, warm, deep brown, quiet with recognition. The same eyes that once stared at him through smoke and ash, the same eyes that used to blink sleepily by the fire. Brody hadn't just survived, he had come home. At first, Tom couldn't trust what he saw. He stood there, motionless on the porch, gripping the edge of the doorway, as if letting go would shatter the fragile image before him. The bear, massive, still, unblinking, made no move. And yet, something in its gaze told him it wasn't just any bear. Tom stepped forward slowly, his breath shallow, every movement deliberate, careful, not out of fear, but reverence. The moment felt borrowed from another lifetime. He was afraid that if he moved too fast, the vision would vanish back into the trees. But the bear didn't run. Instead, it took one lumbering step closer and lowered its head, pressing its great muzzle gently into Tom's weathered hand. The man's fingers trembled. The warmth of that coarse fur against his palm brought it all back. The bottle feeds, the games in the clearing, the painful goodbye at the forest's edge. 22 years melted in an instant. Tom's eyes welled. He didn't try to stop the tears. In that moment, time stood still. And from that day forward, Brody came back. Every morning. He'd appear just as the light crept over the ridges, lying beneath the cabin's window like a silent guardian. He'd follow Tom along the familiar trails, never too close, never too far. When Tom paused, Brody paused. When he walked, Brody walked. There were no words between them. There didn't need to be. Tom, for the first time in years, felt something awaken in his chest, a quiet joy, rich with memory and wonder. He dusted off an old notebook and began to write again. A memoir he titled, I Raised a Bear. It wasn't meant for the world. It was a conversation with the past, a way to hold on to something that had returned when he thought it lost forever. But peace never stays long in borrowed moments. 1 week later, the silence of the forest was broken not by wildlife, but by protocol. A new supervisor had been appointed to the regional office, Jason Reeves. Young, sharp-creased, clipboard in hand, and eyes that measured everything in liability. He had no time for folklore or forest legends. To him, a bear was a threat. A wild animal should stay wild, or be removed. He visited Tom's cabin, looked at the paw prints in the dirt, the tufts of fur snagged on bark, and issued an order. You need to report the animal, Jason said, voice clipped. This is an active violation of wildlife regulations. That bear's not a pet. It's dangerous. And it's near human activity. Tom stood his ground. He's not dangerous. He's home. Jason didn't argue. He simply turned and made a note in his ledger. 2 days later, Tom returned from his usual patrol and knew something was wrong before he reached the clearing. The air felt wrong. Still. Empty. No bear. No tracks. Only one thing sat in the dirt, half buried in pine needles. A satellite collar with its beacon flashing silently. Useless now. Tom dropped to one knee, staring at the collar as if it might explain what had happened. But he didn't need an explanation. He already knew. Jason had sent a team. They'd set a trap, and they'd taken Brody. Tom drove straight to the district outpost in Bozeman, knocked until his knuckles turned red. No answer. Finally, through a speaker, a voice, Jason's, cut through. The animal's been transferred to a private holding facility. It was a safety concern. You brought a predator into human proximity. That's a breach of regulation. No room for questions. No space for heart. Just rules. Protocols. Tom stood there in the doorway long after the line went silent. Rain began to fall, soaking through his jacket, but he didn't move. Something inside him, something fragile and quiet, cracked. He hadn't just lost a bear. He'd lost him again. And this time, he didn't know if he'd get him back. Tom could have given up, could have watched the forest from his window and told himself it was too late. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out to old friends, wardens, journalists, wildlife advocates. Then, quietly, he posted a photo of Brody and 3 words, #FreeBrody. The internet caught fire. People who had read his memoirs rallied. Small towns held signs. News crews showed up. The world demanded answers. But Tom didn't wait. He tracked down the facility, a private holding center for aggressive wildlife. Cold concrete, metal bars, no light. And in one of the cells, Brody sat like stone. When he saw Tom, he didn't move, just rose slowly, and placed his paw against the glass. Tom pressed his hand to the same spot. The next morning, the headlines were surreal. Bear missing, no sign of escape. The gate was open. A ladder leaned against the wall, and in the dirt, a set of massive paw prints. Beside them, old ranger boots. Tom and Brody were gone. Days passed. Then a drone spotted them, an old man and a bear by a campfire deep in the national forest. Silent. Together. Reporters begged for interviews. No one found them. At the cabin, only one note remained. I didn't steal a bear. I brought my family home. If that doesn't make sense to you, maybe it's not supposed to. No one has seen them since, but locals still whisper, out beyond the pine ridges there's a quiet place, and if you're lucky, you might glimpse a ranger walking an old trail, with a bear right beside him, always beside him.